Greetings, it's your host, Gabe Morales. In these next couple episodes, we are going to talk about an individual who is famous for his horrific criminal plots, but also we are going to talk about the psyche of individuals who follow religious and political cults, or are sometimes just plain straight out wackos. We are going to discuss Charlie Mills Manson and his virtually adopted family, which operated in the 1960s through 70s and beyond. Manson was a semi-talented musician and self-proclaimed hippie messiah who stated that he was the spawn of Jesus Christ, Satan, and Hitler combined, who dispatched his apostles, also known as the Manson family, to go out on killing sprees throughout the greater Los Angeles area. Once he was arrested due to numerous crimes committed by his followers, the prosecution contended that while Manson did not specifically give direct orders for these multiple murders, his wild and crazy ideologies constituted an overt act of conspiracy to do so. Before these murders, Manson had spent more than half his life in correctional institutions, and his younger life was also disturbed, as we soon shall see. While gathering his fairly large cult following, Manson was a singer-songwriter on the fringe of the Los Angeles music industry, chiefly through a loose association with Dennis Wilson of Beach Boys fame, who introduced Manson to record producer Terry Melcher. Melcher was the son of popular singer-actress Doris Day and her first husband, a musician named Al Jordan. In 1968, the Beach Boys recorded a Manson song, Cease to Exist, but they renamed it Never Learn Not to Love and released it as a 45 B-side single, but did so without giving any credits to Manson. This angered and frustrated Charlie as he attempted to secure a record contract via Melcher, but was unsuccessful. Dennis Wilson states that he picked up Manson girls Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey when they were hitchhiking one day in late spring 1968, and when they were under the influence of alcohol and LSD. He took them to his Pacific Palisades estate for a few hours until they could come down from their high. The following morning, when Wilson returned after conducting an all-night recording session, he was greeted by Charles Manson in the driveway, who emerged out the front door of Wilson's house. Wilson asked whether the stranger intended to hurt him. Manson assured him that he had no such intentions and began to kiss Wilson's feet. Once inside the house, Wilson discovered there were a dozen of Charlie's followers, mostly females, who were using the house as a crash pad and place to party. Manson would often lecture his followers about the English rock band Beatles' hidden secret messages in their songs, including on their 1968 White Album, specifically a song called Helter Skelter. According to Los Angeles District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, when Manson was under the influence of psychedelic drugs, he felt moved by his interpretation of Beatles lyrics and soon adopted the term helter skelter to describe what he felt was an impending race war in America. After the Manson family trials, Bugliosi wrote a popular book by the same title. Charles Miles Maddox, who later took on the name Manson, was born on November 12, 1934. To 15-year-old Kathleen Bauer Cavender Maddox in Cincinnati, Ohio. Manson's biological father was said to have been the much older Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., who hailed from Kentucky, against whom Kathleen Maddox filed a paternity lawsuit that resulted in an agreed court judgment in 1937. Like Elvis Presley's boss, this colonel also had a local reputation as being a con artist. He allowed Maddox to believe that he was a real colonel, although colonel was merely his given first name. When Maddox told Scott that she was pregnant, he quickly told her that he had just been called out on Army military duty orders. And after several months of being gone, she decided that he never was going to return. Charles Manson may have never met his biological father. In August 1934, a few months before Charlie's birth, his mother married William Eugene Manson. Kathleen often went on drinking sprees with her brother Luther, leaving Charlie behind with multiple babysitters. Finally, William Manson had enough, and he filed for divorce from Kathleen, alleging gross neglect of duty, basically stating that she was an unfit mother and wife. But Charles retained William's last name of Manson. In August 1939, brother and sister Luther and Kathleen were arrested for assault and robbery, and they were tried and convicted and sentenced to 10 and 5 years respectively. Manson was then placed in the home of an aunt in West Virginia until his mother was paroled in 1942. Manson later characterized the first weeks that he spent with his mother after she was released as the happiest time in his life. But Charlie continuously skipped school during many days to be close to his mother while she slept all day after drinking all night. Kathleen and her son then moved to Indianapolis, where she met an alcoholic with the last name of Lewis, and she married him in August 1943. Meanwhile, Charlie continued to be a juvenile delinquent. Manson stated that when he was 9, he set his school on fire and often got into trouble for truancy and petty theft. Since there was a lack of foster home placements in 1947, at the age of 13, Manson was placed in the very strict Gabault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. This was a school for delinquents ran by Catholic priests and was very strict. They often dished out punishments by wooden paddle or by belt. And after getting into trouble, often and not wanting to face the punishment, Manson soon ran away from the Catholic school and slept in the woods, under bridges, or wherever else he could find shelter. He then fled home to his mother and spent Christmas of 1947 at his aunt and uncle's house. He later ran away to Indianapolis, whereby in 1948 he committed his first known major crime by robbing a grocery store, and he used the money from that job to help pay for a place to stay on Indianapolis's Skid Row. For a short time, he attempted to do legitimate work, but that was just not in the cards. So he soon resorted back to petty theft to survive. He was eventually caught, and in 1949, a judge sentenced him to Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska. After just 4 days of being at Boys Town, Charlie and a fellow student named Blackie Nelson obtained a gun and stole a car. They used it to commit 2 robberies on their way to Nilsson's uncle's home in Peoria, Illinois. Nilsson's uncle was a professional thief, and once the boys arrived, he took them on as his apprentices and schooled them in the art of thievery. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid on a Peoria store, and police investigation linked him to 2 other robberies. He was then sent to the Indiana Boys School, also a strict reform school. At the school, other students allegedly raped Charlie with the encouragement of a crooked staff member, and he was repeatedly beaten by staff and other boys. So he states he ran away from the school multiple times. It was during some of these incidents that Charlie developed his own self-defense technique of playing the insane game. When he is physically unable to defend himself, he would make screeching sounds, grimace his face, and wave his arms wildly to convince his attackers that he was insane. He was also able to cross his eyes and give deep, dark stares that he would be known for the rest of his life. And he often later chuckled when people freaked out on this act.
It's a consciousness that lives in your mind.
After a number of failed attempts, he escaped with 2 other boys. In February 1951, the 3 escapees began robbing gas filling stations and attempted to drive to California in a stolen vehicle, but they were arrested in Utah. For the federal crime of driving a stolen vehicle across state lines, Manson was sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys, and he would be caught up in the federal criminal justice system for many years. Forever the hustler and con artist, by November 1958, Manson was pimping out a 16-year-old girl and was receiving additional income from another girl he conned who had wealthy parents. In September 1959, he pled guilty to attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after a young woman named Leona, who had an arrest record for prostitution, made a tearful plea before court that she and Manson were deeply in love and that she would marry Charlie if he were freed. Soon she did marry Manson so that she would not be required to testify against him. Manson then took Leona and another woman to New Mexico for the purposes of prostitution, resulting in him being held and interrogated for violations of the Mann Act, and he was charged with pimping April of 1960. For violating his probation on an attempted check cashing scheme, his parole was revoked and he was ordered to serve his 10-year sentence. Among his fellow prisoners at the LA County Jail was Danny Trejo, who later did time at San Quentin Prison, where Manson also later did time. Trejo states when he first met Manson at the LA County Jail in 1961, he felt sorry for him and looked out for him. Trejo was a champion boxer in prison and an associate of the Mexican Mafia. He later went on to have roles in several Hollywood movies. In July 1961, Manson was transferred from the LA County Jail to the U.S. Penitentiary located at McNeil Island, Washington, just offshore from Lakewood, Washington. I knew many officers who worked at McNeil after it had been mothballed under federal control and was taken over by Washington Department of Corrections. It was while doing time at McNeil that Manson took guitar lessons from Alvin Creepy Karpis, who was part of the Ma Barker gang. Manson sometimes even performed for other inmates. It was then that he became attracted to the music and entertainment business. And from another inmate, he acquired the contacts of Phil Kaufman, who worked at Universal Studios in Hollywood, California. In 1963, Leona was granted a divorce from Charles Manson. During the time they were together, she alleges that they had a son together named Charles Luther Manson. By the time Charles Manson had been released from federal prison in March of 1967, he had spent more than half his 32 years incarcerated. He moved to Berkeley and often visited San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district during the 1967 Summer of Love, and eventually secured an apartment there, where he lived with some of his adopted hippie family. Dr. Roger Smith, as well as a local clinic director, Dr. David Smith, received government funding from the National Institute of Health and reportedly of the Central Intelligence Agency, yes, the CIA, to study the effects of drugs like LSD and methamphetamine on people. Many of the participants in the study were part of the counterculture movement, and some of their subjects also included Charles Manson and his Manson family. One of the first books he read when he got out of prison was a best-selling book of all time, Dale Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People. Manson also read Stranger in a Strange Land, a science fiction novel, and he used things from these books and others, as well as Summer of Love philosophies, the Bible, Scientology, and groups like the Beatles to create his own personal philosophy on life and that of the world. Every prophet has their ideologies, and Manson was no different. He taught two main things. The first was ATWA, which stood for air, trees, water, and animals. Manson believed that man and woman should live in balance with these four things. His second main idea was helter-skelter, which I mentioned earlier. You have to remember there was a lot of racial strife and inner-city riots in America at the time. Manson believed that blacks would band together and become so powerful that they would kill all the whites, except Manson and his family. He called this war helter-skelter, and he encouraged his followers to instigate that race war, since he was basically a white supremacist. He believed after this war was over that blacks would not be intelligent enough to lead themselves, so they would need a leader or messiah. His bizarre but interesting teachings attracted a large number of followers, especially young white females, often runaways, who were looking for a father figure. He specifically targeted individuals for manipulation who were emotionally insecure and were social outcasts. Manson had already gained his first follower when he would visit the UC Berkeley campus, a librarian by the name of Mary Bruner. He talked her into letting him sleep at her house a few nights, an arrangement that soon became permanent. He then met Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a runaway teen, and convinced her to live with him and Bruner. Some state that Manson would reprogram these followers' minds to submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and other drugs, and engage in unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept everything he poured into them. Manson family member Paul Watkins later testified in court that Manson would encourage his group to use the psychedelic drug LSD in large doses, while Manson himself would take smaller doses to keep his wits about him and in order to control and indoctrinate the group. By the end of his stay in the Haight-Ashbury district in 1968, Manson had attracted about 20 or so followers, including Charles Tex Watson, a musician and former small-time actor, as well as Bobby Beausoleil, a former musician and porn actor. These two individuals, as well as Manson follower Mary Bruner, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten all would soon be key figures in conducting multiple murders. While being supervised by parole officer Roger Smith, Manson grew his family while he supervised drug use and prostitution, it appears without any interference or without good checks on behavior and conduct, as good parole officers are supposed to do. What is also interesting to me is that Manson later had a friend and cellmate in prison named Roger Smith. This Roger Smith was known as Pincushion, and he was called that because he had been stabbed so many times, over 100 times, in separate incidents, that his body looked like a pincushion. He was also once called the most dangerous and psychopathic inmate ever housed at San Quentin prison by one warden. I don't know about being the most dangerous, but he certainly was a pathological liar and probably bullied Charles Manson, who probably felt he needed a bodyguard. And what better person than to stand behind Pincushion, who had been hit multiple times and was still standing. I had Shitty Smitty, aka Pincushion, on my yard at New Folsom before he was transferred out to Corcoran, where he did time with Charlie. Although many people tried over the years, including a vicious called hit featured in one of my episodes by Mexican mafia shot-caller Champ Reynoso, it seemed nobody could kill Pincushion. The Spahn Movie Ranch was a 55-acre movie set located just outside of Los Angeles. At one time, it was used as a ranch, a dairy farm, and later used to shoot Western movies. After a decline in use of Western films in America during the 1950s, you probably remember Clint Eastwood's films or spaghetti westerns had to move to Italy and Europe because producers in America wanted to make those kinds of movies anymore. This created an economic crunch for George Spahn, the owner of the property. And so he established horse stables for tourists to go out on horseback rides and use Manson followers to help maintain the ranch and his horses. Spahn at that time was 80 years old and going blind when he allowed the Manson family to move in and live rent-free in exchange for their labor. Longtime Manson family member Squeaky Fromm later wrote that she was very impressed with George Spahn's hardiness, even though he was an old man. In the 1970 trial, prosecutor Bugliosi claimed that Manson would occasionally send one of his girls to Spahn's room for sexual encounters, and one of them was said to be Squeaky. A few years later, after the Manson murder trials, in September 1975, Fromm went to Sacramento's Capitol Park to allegedly plead with President Gerald Ford, who was visiting, about the environmental plight of the California redwoods. She was dressed in a red robe like a high priestess when she pulled out a Colt .45 pistol. The pistol's magazine was loaded with 4 rounds, but there was no round in the chamber. She later stated that she never intended to kill the president, and when she pointed the gun at Ford, she was immediately restrained by a Secret Service agent, tried, convicted, and sent to federal prison. That concludes part 1 of True Crime Profiles of Charles Manson and the Manson family. Part 2 will resume shortly. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.